Guys, what you're about to see has already been watched more than 50 million times in just 48 hours. I'm not exaggerating. This is the video that crashed Reddit, forced Wikipedia to lock its Bigfoot page, and even pushed the University of Washington to hold an emergency press conference. Back in October 2024, Jake Jackson, a software engineer from Seattle, was hiking solo through the Cascade Mountains. He was nearly 40 miles from the nearest town, completely off trail, when he stopped to refill his water bottle at a creek. What he captured next on his Canon R5 has been called the most important zoological discovery of the 21st century. Not blurry shadows, not distant silhouettes. 4 Bigfoots, crystal clear, in full 4 Kelvin's resolution. At 120 frames per second, you can see their facial expressions. You can see them using tools. You can see them communicating with each other. 20 minutes of footage so sharp, so undeniable, that even the most hardened skeptics have gone silent. Dr. Jennifer Holbrook, a primatologist at the University of Washington, analyzed the footage frame by frame. Her conclusion: this could not be faked with current technology. Hollywood special effects teams tried to replicate it and failed. The micro movements of muscles beneath the hair, the way water drips off their bodies, the anatomical consistency, it's flawless. And then things went from shocking to absolutely insane. DNA test results came back. Samples of hair Jake collected at the site revealed a previously unknown primate species that diverged from the human lineage around 2 million years ago. We're talking about an intelligent, 8-foot-tall, 800-pound being that has been living alongside us this entire time. The government's response was immediate. Emergency legislation, federal protection, the creation of the Sasquatch National Preserve. It is now a federal crime to hunt or harass these creatures. Think about that. In less than 6 months, Bigfoot went from folklore to federally protected species. And here's the kicker. Native American tribes are saying, "We told you so." They've had traditions for generations about respecting and avoiding these beings. Their oral histories dismissed for centuries as myth have turned out to be scientific truth. The most terrifying moment came when Jake was filming. One of them stopped, turned its head, and looked straight in his direction as if it knew, as if it was fully aware of being watched. Jake later admitted he couldn't move for nearly 10 minutes after they walked away, paralyzed by the realization of what he had just witnessed. And it wasn't the only sighting. A wildlife biologist with the U.S. Forest Service in Northern California recorded thermal imagery of an entire family. Those locations are now classified. Scientists are deploying AI-powered camera systems across millions of acres of wilderness, and what we're discovering is chilling. These creatures have been actively avoiding us. They're smart enough to understand human patterns and to hide. That morning, when Jake Jackson stumbled into them by pure chance, changed everything. Anthropology textbooks are being rewritten, conservation laws are being reshaped. Humanity is being forced to accept that North America is shared with another intelligent species. The footage you're about to see is 100% real, 100% verified, and 100% shocking. This isn't a hoax. This isn't CGI. This is the moment humanity learns, beyond any doubt, that we are not alone. And once you see it, you'll understand why the scientific community has been thrown into chaos. Brace yourself, because after watching this, you will never look at the forest the same way again. Jake Jackson had been hiking the Pacific Northwest Trail for 15 years, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened that October morning deep in the Cascades. A software engineer from Seattle, he had taken a week off just to escape the endless cycle of code reviews and sprint meetings that had consumed his life for the past 3 years. His girlfriend, Sarah, suggested Hawaii, but Jake craved solitude, the kind only the deep wilderness could provide. He packed his customized backpack with a camera rig, a habit he'd developed over years of solo treks to capture landscapes that cleared his mind. The trail he chose barely appeared on maps anymore, a forgotten logging road, abandoned since the early 1990 seconds. Exactly the kind of path Jake loved, where he could hike for hours without seeing another soul. He was nearly 40 miles from the nearest town, lost in old-growth forest where cell service was nothing but a memory. Morning fog clung to the Douglas firs like ghostly fingers, and the only sounds were his breath and the crunch of pine needles beneath his boots. He had been walking since sunrise, making good time despite the rugged terrain. The overgrown trail wound through dense underbrush, tracing the natural contours of the ridge. Jake had learned to read the forest through years of hiking, picking up on the subtle signs most people would miss. Deer trails crossed paths with old traces of human passage. Water always found the path of least resistance, carving out natural corridors through the wilderness. It was this attention to detail that led him to notice strange markings on several trees as he descended toward the creek valley he had spotted on his topographic map. These marks were unlike anything he had ever seen before. They were too high off the ground to be made by bears, nearly 9 feet up, and consisted of deep gashes in the bark that looked deliberate rather than random. Jake had come across bear sign plenty of times, but these were different. The spacing suggested fingers rather than claws, and the marks carried an almost methodical pattern. He pulled out his phone to photograph them, a habit rooted in his technical background, where documentation was everything. Even though he had no signal to share the images right away, he pressed on toward the creek, noticing more and more signs that unsettled him. Large impressions in the soft earth looked eerily like human footprints, but they were far too big. He placed his size 1/1 boot next to one for scale and felt a chill run down his spine. The impression was nearly twice as long as his foot and proportionally wide. His rational mind searched for explanations, but none seemed to fit. The stride length implied by the spacing suggested a biped with a gait that could only belong to something over 7 feet tall. The sound of running water grew louder as he neared the creek. Jake planned to refill his canteen here and maybe take a longer break for lunch. The forest opened slightly near the water's edge, forming a natural corridor where sunlight pierced through the canopy. Carefully, he descended the steep embankment, using exposed roots as handholds. His backpack, heavy with camera gear, including his Canon R5 with a 600mm telephoto lens he used for wildlife photography, made the descent more difficult than usual. When he reached a stable position behind a massive fallen cedar about 30 yards from the stream, Jake decided to set up a few landscape shots. The way the light cut through the mist and trees created an almost surreal atmosphere he wanted to capture. He was mounting his camera on the tripod when a sound froze him in place. It wasn't the usual forest noises he had grown accustomed to over the years. This sound was different, almost like a voice, but not quite human. The tone was deeper, rougher, and carried a cadence that suggested some form of communication. Jake lowered himself slowly behind the fallen tree, his heart racing. Years of wildlife photography had taught him patience and the importance of concealment. He carefully rested the camera on the log, raising the telephoto lens to scan the opposite bank. What he saw through the viewfinder made his hands shake so violently he had to grip the camera with both hands just to hold steady. 3 figures stood in the shallow water near the far bank. They were massive, covered in dark brown and reddish hair, and unmistakably bipedal. Jake's mind raced, struggling to process what he was seeing. Every rational part of his brain screamed that this was impossible, that Bigfoot was just a legend, a mix of misidentified bears and overactive imaginations. But there they were, clear as day through his lens, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost human, yet fundamentally different. The largest of the 3 stood close to 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a powerful frame visible even beneath the thick coat of hair. It moved through the water with deliberate purpose, occasionally bending down to inspect something beneath the surface. The way it used its hands, the intentionality of its movements, the obvious intelligence behind its actions all suggested something far more complex than any known animal. Jake's fingers found the record button on instinct. His camera was already set to capture 4 Kelvin's video at 120 frames per second, a configuration he used for wildlife to produce smooth, detailed footage that could later be slowed down for analysis. As he peered through the lens, a 4th figure emerged from the trees on the opposite bank. Slightly smaller than the largest one, it moved with the same steady, powerful gait. They seemed to be communicating through a series of low sounds and subtle gestures. Jake was struck by how at ease they appeared, clearly unaware of his presence. They moved through the water, pausing occasionally to drink or examine something. One of them picked up a large rock and turned it over, as if searching for crayfish or other prey hidden beneath. Jake's hands had stopped shaking. His instincts as a documentarian had taken over. He adjusted the camera settings slightly to account for the difficult lighting conditions, the interplay of shadow and the blinding reflections off the water. He had filmed bears, wolves, and mountain lions before, but this was something entirely different. He had filmed bears, wolves, and mountain lions for years, but nothing had prepared him for this. The intelligence in their movements, the way they interacted with one another, it was unlike anything he had ever experienced. For 20 minutes, Jake remained frozen in place, barely daring to breathe as he filmed. His camera's memory card could store hours of 4 Kelvin's footage, and he was grateful he had invested in the high-capacity cards despite their hefty price. The creatures carried on with their activities, seemingly focused on foraging in and around the creek. One of them moved into a deeper pool and submerged almost entirely, only its head remaining above the water. When it surfaced, it shook itself in a way uncannily similar to a dog, sending droplets spraying in every direction. The smallest of the group, Jake estimated it to be about 6.5 feet tall, wandered closer to his position, though it remained on the opposite bank. Through the lens, he could make out astonishing detail. The face was distinctly primitive, yet carried proportions strikingly human. Deep-set dark eyes, a broad, flat nose, and a mouth wider than that of a human, but with clearly defined lips. The hair on the face was shorter and finer than on the rest of the body, allowing glimpses of skin beneath a gray, black, or charcoal tone. Jake carefully zoomed in further, the lens's image stabilization compensating for the faint tremor in his hands. He could now see the creature's hands clearly as it picked up rocks at the water's edge. They were enormous, with thick fingers that nonetheless displayed remarkable dexterity. The thumb was opposable, and the creature used it skillfully to grasp and manipulate objects. The proportions differed from a human hand, broader, more powerful looking, but the function was unmistakable. Suddenly, the largest of the beings rose to its full height and let out a low, resonant call that Jake felt as much as heard. The others instantly stopped what they were doing and turned to look upstream, in the same direction as Jake's position. There was a palpable tension in their posture now, a vigilance absent before. Jake held his breath, wondering if they had detected him, but their attention seemed fixed elsewhere. After several taut moments, the creatures began moving upstream, striding through the shallows with astonishing speed despite their massive size. Jake kept filming, panning his camera to follow their movement. As they departed, he had a clear view of their gait, the swing of their long arms, the breadth of their shoulders, the narrowness of their hips, the massive musculature visible even beneath thick fur. One of them paused and glanced back, scanning the forest on both sides of the creek. Jake remained utterly motionless, knowing any movement could draw its attention. When they finally vanished around a bend in the creek, he stayed rooted in place for another 10 minutes, barely able to comprehend what had just happened. His camera continued recording, capturing the empty stream as though to prove the space had been occupied only minutes earlier. At last, he stopped the recording and carefully reviewed the footage on the camera's LCD screen. The video was clear, stable, and undeniable. This wasn't some blurry, ambiguous clip that could be dismissed as a hoax or misidentification. This was professional quality footage of creatures not supposed to exist. Jake's mind reeled with the implications. He was sitting on what might be the most significant zoological discovery in modern history, but he was also alone, miles from civilization. Having just witnessed something that shattered everything he thought he knew about the natural world, he carefully packed away his camera gear, his movements slow and deliberate to avoid making any noise. The creatures had gone upstream, so he decided to head downstream first before cutting back through the forest toward his vehicle. The hike back seemed endless. Every sound in the woods made him jump. Every shadow could have been one of those beings. Jake had never felt fear like this in the wilderness before. It wasn't exactly the fear of a predator, it was something more primal, the fear of the unknown, of having stepped into a world governed by rules utterly different from those he thought he understood. He moved as quickly as he could, following his GPS back to the trailhead where he had parked his Toyota 4Runner. Dusk was closing in by the time he finally reached the vehicle. Jake tossed his backpack into the back and sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, just breathing, trying to process what had happened. He pulled out the camera and replayed the footage on the small screen. It was all there, crystal clear. He had managed to capture several minutes of close-range, high-definition video of multiple Sasquatch in their natural habitat. His hands shook as he removed the memory card and placed it in a protective case. Then he tucked that case into the glove compartment. He still had backup cards with the same footage inside the camera, but he wasn't willing to take chances. The 4-hour drive back to Seattle passed in a blur. Jake barely noticed the time. His mind churned with questions and decisions. What was he supposed to do with this footage? Who should he tell? Would anyone even believe him? He knew the Bigfoot research community was riddled with hoaxes and dubious evidence. But this was different. This was clear, undeniable proof. He had been in the right place at the right time with the right equipment, and he had captured something extraordinary. When he finally arrived at his Capitol Hill apartment, Jake immediately backed up the footage to multiple drives. He created encrypted copies and stored them in several locations, one in his fireproof safe, another in his bank's safe deposit box. The next morning, he spent hours reviewing the footage frame by frame on his large screen, noticing details he had missed in the field. Muscles rippling beneath fur, the way their feet gripped the rocky creek bed, subtle expressions flashing across their faces. It was overwhelming. Jake knew he couldn't keep this to himself, but he also understood he had to be cautious about how he released the information. He had seen what happened to others who claimed encounters with Sasquatch. They were mocked, dismissed, their reputations destroyed. But he had something no one else had ever produced before: clear, professional-grade footage that couldn't easily be ignored. He spent the following week researching, carefully reaching out to primatologists and anthropologists, seeking trustworthy scientists who might be willing to review his footage without immediately writing him off as a crank. His breakthrough came when he connected with Dr. Jennifer Holbrook, a researcher at the University of Washington who had published papers on the theoretical possibility of undiscovered primate species. At first, she was skeptical, but when Jake showed her a few still frames from his video, her doubt shifted into deep intrigue. She agreed to meet with him privately to review the full footage. Jake would never forget the look on her face the first time she watched it, the way her scientific skepticism collided with the evidence unfolding before her eyes. Dr. Holbrook brought in colleagues, experts in anatomy, locomotion, and primate behavior. They analyzed the footage using every tool available, searching for signs of digital manipulation or evidence of a hoax. They found nothing. The depth of field remained consistent. Lighting matched perfectly across every element in the frame. Muscular movement beneath the fur displayed anatomical consistency nearly impossible to fake. A primate locomotion specialist pointed out subtle details in the way the creatures moved, suggesting foot structures different from both humans and known great apes adaptations that made sense for a large, bipedal organism navigating mountainous forest terrain. The question of how to release the footage to the public became a matter of careful strategy. Dr. Holbrook and her colleagues understood that the scientific community would be skeptical, as it should be. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. They decided to prepare a comprehensive analysis to accompany the release, documenting every test they had performed to verify its authenticity. Jake worked with them to provide exact GPS coordinates of the site, weather data from that day, and full details of his camera setup and equipment specifications. They also decided to publish the footage simultaneously across multiple platforms to prevent any single entity from controlling the narrative. Jake created accounts on several video sharing sites, preparing the uploads but leaving them unpublished. Meanwhile, Dr. Holbrook reached out to contacts at National Geographic, the Smithsonian, and several major universities. They wanted credible scientific voices involved in the conversation from the very beginning. The night before the scheduled release, Jake couldn't sleep. He sat in his apartment overlooking the Seattle skyline, knowing that in just a few hours, everything would change. He thought about the creatures in that creek, living their lives, unaware that their existence was about to be revealed to the world. He wondered if he was doing the right thing. Part of him wished he could protect them, keep their secret, but he also knew that scientific truth had its own imperative. If these beings existed, and now he knew beyond doubt that they did, humanity deserved to know. At exactly 9 a.m. Pacific time, the footage went live. Jake had edited it down to the 5 clearest, most compelling minutes, though the scientists had carefully reviewed the full 20. At the same time, Dr. Holbrook published a preliminary analysis on the university's website and in several academic forums. Within minutes, the views began climbing exponentially. Jake's phone lit up with calls from news outlets, researchers, and unfamiliar numbers. The initial reaction was exactly what they expected: a mixture of excitement, skepticism, and outright dismissal. A few special effects experts immediately claimed they could reproduce the footage with CGI or practical effects, but when challenged to match its level of anatomical detail and biological accuracy, none could. Primatologists who examined the video pointed to numerous anatomical features consistent with an undiscovered great ape, yet distinct enough from known species to represent something entirely new. Within 48 hours, Jake's footage had been viewed over 50 million times across multiple platforms. He found himself at the epicenter of a media storm unlike anything he had ever imagined. Major news networks wanted interviews. Documentary filmmakers sought exclusive rights to his story. Enthusiasts of cryptozoology hailed him as a hero. But Jake tried to keep his focus on the science. He worked closely with Dr. Holbrook and her team. He provided additional details from his observations and helped organize a fully funded scientific expedition to the area. The expedition was hastily assembled but well-equipped, thanks to the enormous public interest. It included primatologists, wildlife biologists, expert trackers, and documentary filmmakers. Jake led them directly to the site where he had made his observations. There, they found physical evidence corroborating his footage, hair samples snagged on branches at unusually high elevations he had recorded, plaster casts of footprints from impressions he had photographed on his way down to the creek, and even what appeared to be primitive tools, stones, intentionally shaped for specific purposes. The hair samples proved critical. DNA analysis revealed something extraordinary. A primate closely related to humans and other great apes, yet distinct enough to constitute a separate species. Genetic markers suggested a divergence from the human lineage roughly 2 million years ago, consistent with some theories of Gigantopithecus or similar extinct apes that may have survived in isolated populations. The scientific community was forced to confront the possibility that Jake's footage was genuine, yet the creatures themselves remained elusive throughout the expedition. Despite weeks of searching with thermal cameras, drone surveillance, and meticulous tracking, no new signs were found. It was as if the beings had completely vanished from the area. Some speculated that the intense media attention had driven them deeper into the wilderness. Others wondered if they had always been this difficult to detect, which could explain their secrecy for so long. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the creatures were actively avoiding human contact, that they were more intelligent and aware than anyone had imagined. The impact of his footage rippled across disciplines. Anthropologists were forced to reconsider human evolution and the possibility of parallel survival of ape-like hominins. Conservation groups immediately began pushing for protected status for vast tracts of Pacific Northwest wilderness. Indigenous communities, many of whom had long traditions of Sasquatch stories, suddenly found their oral histories validated in the eyes of Western science. Several Native American elders reached out to Jake, sharing stories passed down for generations, accounts that aligned in remarkable detail with what he had observed. Jake, however, struggled with the sudden fame and relentless attention. He had never sought the spotlight, and the constant scrutiny was exhausting. Strangers showed up at his apartment building, trying to interview or photograph him. At first, his employer was supportive, but eventually concerns arose about disruptions in the workplace. Ultimately, Jake took a leave of absence, using part of the money he earned from licensing his footage to documentary producers to fund his own research efforts. He frequently returned to the wilderness, though never to the exact same spot. He felt a responsibility to shield the creatures from hunters, both literal and metaphorical, now scouring the forests of the Pacific Northwest. Working with conservationists, he helped establish monitoring protocols designed to protect any discovered populations while still allowing for scientific study. Balancing discovery with protection became his primary focus. 6 months after the release of his initial footage, a second credible sighting was reported by a U.S. Forest Service wildlife biologist in Northern California. Following the protocols established after Jake's discovery, the biologist was able to capture thermal imagery of a family group moving through dense forest at night. While not as clear as Jake's video, it provided further evidence of a breeding population. The location was immediately classified, with access restricted to authorized researchers. Jake became instrumental in forming what would later be called the North American Primate Research Initiative, a collaboration among universities, government agencies, and conservation groups. The goal was to study these creatures while minimizing human impact on their populations. Advanced camera traps equipped with AI recognition systems were deployed across millions of acres of wilderness, programmed to detect and record any bipedal beings that matched certain parameters, while instantly encrypting and transmitting the data to prevent tampering or exploitation. Scientific papers stemming from Jake's footage and subsequent evidence revolutionized primatology. The beings, provisionally classified as Homo Sasquatch, appeared to represent a parallel evolutionary path, one that had developed its own unique adaptations for forest life. Their apparent intelligence, demonstrated by tool use and complex social behaviors observed in Jake's footage, suggested cognitive abilities approaching those of early human ancestors. Some researchers even hypothesized that they might possess a form of language based on the vocalizations Jake had recorded. Jake often thought back to that morning by the creek, a simple hike that had changed not only his life, but potentially humanity's entire understanding of its place in the natural world. He received letters from people across the globe, some thanking him for proving a belief they had held for years, others sharing their own encounters they had never spoken of for fear of ridicule. Most moving of all were the messages from indigenous peoples, who felt Western science had finally caught up to traditional knowledge their cultures had preserved for millennia. The search for additional populations continued, expanding beyond the Pacific Northwest. Similar beings were reported in the Himalayas, the Russian Far East, and remote regions of Canada and Alaska. Each sighting added weight to the growing body of evidence that Homo Sasquatch, or related species, may have survived and thrived alongside human civilization while remaining largely hidden. The implications for conservation biology were staggering. If a large primate species could remain undiscovered until the 21st century, what else might still be out there? Jake established the Jackson Foundation for Cryptozoological Research, using the proceeds from his footage and subsequent book contracts to fund serious scientific investigations into unreported species. He insisted on rigorous scientific standards, refusing to support anything that smelled of sensationalism or pseudoscience. His experience had taught him that extraordinary discoveries required extraordinary discipline and method. The Foundation's grants supported young researchers employing cutting-edge technology to explore remote ecosystems, leading to the discovery of numerous new species, though none as groundbreaking as his original find. The legal implications of his discovery proved complex and far-reaching. Should these creatures be granted legal protection akin to that of indigenous peoples? They were clearly more intelligent than many animals already protected under endangered species laws, yet they were not human in the traditional sense. The debate raged in courtrooms and legislatures, with Jake often called upon as an expert witness. He consistently advocated for the strongest protections possible, arguing that these beings deserved the right to exist free from human interference. Private expeditions seeking to capture or kill a specimen for profit became a serious concern. Jake worked with law enforcement to establish penalties for harassing or harming the creatures. Though enforcement in remote wilderness areas remained challenging, several states passed emergency laws making it a crime to hunt or capture what were now officially recognized as North American forest primates. The federal government eventually followed suit, creating the Sasquatch National Preserve, a network of connected wilderness areas across multiple states where the beings were known or suspected to exist. Jake's relationship with Sarah did not survive the upheaval. The relentless attention, weeks spent on expeditions away from home, and his fundamental shift in priorities proved too much. She supported his work but could not adapt to life under the spotlight. They parted amicably, and Jake threw himself deeper into his research and conservation efforts. He found purpose in protecting the remarkable beings he had once been privileged to observe. Years passed, and the initial excitement gave way to a more measured scientific approach. Occasional sightings were reported and verified, yet the creatures remained elusive. Some researchers proposed that this was intentional, that the beings were intelligent enough to understand the threat posed by humans and actively avoided contact. Jake seemed to agree. The brief encounter he had witnessed by the creek felt more and more like a rare gift, a fleeting glimpse into a hidden world that had existed parallel to ours for millennia. He often returned to the wilderness, not specifically to seek the creatures, but simply to hike and observe. At times, he thought he felt something watching him from the forest, a presence just beyond the edge of awareness. He never pursued these feelings, respecting the boundary between their world and ours. If they chose to remain hidden, he felt it was their right. His role was to prove they existed and to ensure they were protected. Beyond that, the choice of contact belonged to them. The impact on popular culture was immediate and enduring. Movies, television shows, and books proliferated most sensationalized, bearing little resemblance to the beings Jake had observed. He sought to counter this through education, speaking at schools and universities about the importance of respecting wildlife and the dangers of mythologizing real creatures. He stressed that these were not monsters or missing links, but sophisticated beings with the right to exist undisturbed. Scientific understanding of the creatures advanced slowly but steadily. Analysis of the hair samples revealed adaptations for cold climates and a diet that appeared largely omnivorous, with a preference for fish and plant matter. Footprint studies suggested remarkable agility despite their size, with foot structures capable of exceptional grip across varied terrain. Vocalizations recorded by remote stations demonstrated a range of complex calls that might indicate sophisticated communication, though no one has yet managed to decode any possible language. Jake collaborated with technology companies to develop non-invasive monitoring systems capable of tracking the beings without disturbing them. Using satellite imagery, AI analysis, and networks of passive sensors, researchers began mapping potential population ranges and migration patterns. The data suggested a population numbering in the low thousands, spread across vast wilderness areas from northern California to Alaska. This relatively small figure underscored the importance of conservation efforts. The discovery also renewed interest in indigenous knowledge systems. Jake worked closely with tribal nations whose traditional territories overlapped with Sasquatch habitat. Many tribes had protocols for interacting or deliberately not interacting with the beings, passed down through generations. These traditional practices, emphasizing respect and avoidance, aligned strikingly well with modern conservation strategies. Some tribes assumed leadership roles in managing protected areas, blending traditional knowledge with contemporary conservation science. Educational programs were launched to teach people living near potential Sasquatch habitats how to coexist with the beings. Similar to bear safety initiatives, these efforts focused on avoiding surprise encounters, securing food sources, and respecting signs of Sasquatch activity. Reports of aggressive encounters were virtually non-existent, suggesting that the beings preferred to avoid humans when given the chance. The few close encounters that were documented typically occurred when humans inadvertently cornered or startled them. Even then, the beings usually chose to retreat rather than confront. Jake's footage became a cornerstone of scientific education, analyzed in universities worldwide as an example of careful documentation of an extraordinary discovery. Students studied not only the content itself, but also his methodology, the patience and preparation that enabled him to capture such clear evidence. He often spoke of the role of chance in scientific discovery, but emphasized that chance favors the prepared mind. His lifelong habit of carrying professional camera gear, honed over years of shooting landscapes, made all the difference. The economic impact on the Pacific Northwest was significant but carefully managed. Ecotourism surged, yet strict regulations prevented the kind of exploitation that could harm either the creatures or their habitat. Guided tours operated under rigid protocols, confined to designated areas and relying only on passive observation techniques. Local communities benefited from the tourism boom while also participating in conservation efforts. A few small towns even renamed themselves after Sasquatch. But Jake worked with them to ensure this was done respectfully, with conservation, not sensationalism, at the center. Remote research stations were established, staffed by rotating teams of scientists who maintained long-term studies of the ecosystem and any signs of the being's activity. These stations operated under strict, low-impact guidelines. All waste was packed out, no permanent structures were built, and noise was kept to a minimum. Researchers lived much like the early naturalists, observing and recording without interference. Jake also funded scholarships for indigenous students interested in wildlife biology and conservation, recognizing that those who held traditional knowledge needed to be part of the scientific conversation. Several of these students went on to make substantial contributions to the field, bridging Western science and traditional knowledge in ways that enriched both. Their work often provided insights that Western-trained scientists might have overlooked, particularly in understanding the creature's behavioral patterns and ecological roles. The psychological impact of the discovery on humanity was studied by philosophers and sociologists. Knowing that we share the planet with another intelligent primate challenged long-held assumptions about human uniqueness and our place in the natural order. Some religious groups struggled to reconcile this new reality with their worldview, while others embraced it as affirmation of the complexity and wonder of creation. The beings became symbols of the mysteries still left in the world, a reminder that, despite our technological and scientific progress, we do not yet know everything. Jake's protocols were formalized to evaluate future sighting claims, creating a standardized system that balanced openness to new evidence with rigorous scientific scrutiny. The Jake Jackson Protocol, as it came to be known, required multiple forms of documentation, immediate collection of physical evidence, and the involvement of qualified scientists from the earliest stages of any investigation. This minimized hoaxes while ensuring that genuine sightings were properly recorded and studied. 10 years after his first encounter, Jake stood on the edge of a cliff overlooking a vast wilderness now protected as critical Sasquatch habitat. He had aged noticeably, the stress and excitement of the past decade etched into his salt and pepper hair and weathered face. But his eyes still carried the same wonder they had that morning by the creek. He had never had another direct sighting, despite spending hundreds of days in the field. At times, he wondered if that single encounter was meant to be unique, a fleeting window into another world that had opened just long enough for him to capture it. The scientific community had largely accepted the existence of Homo, Sasquatch, though debates continued over their evolution, intelligence, and proper classification. Some argued they should be regarded as a type of human based on their intelligence and tool use. Others maintained they were an entirely separate species. Jake stayed out of these debates, focusing instead on practical conservation efforts. For him, classification mattered far less than ensuring their survival and freedom. He received numerous awards and honors from scientific societies, conservation groups, and indigenous nations. Yet the recognition that meant the most came from a group of forestry workers who had spent their lives in the wilderness. They told him that his discovery, and the protections that followed, had preserved vast stretches of old-growth forest that otherwise might have been logged. In an unintended way, the beings had become saviors of ecosystems, their very presence justifying the protection of millions of acres of wilderness. Jake often spoke to young people interested in science and conservation. He emphasized that discovery wasn't just about finding something new, but about being prepared to recognize and document it when it happened. He spoke about the importance of patience, preparation, and respect for the natural world. Many in his audiences had grown up in a world where Sasquatch was accepted as fact rather than myth. Still, he tried to convey the sense of impossibility and wonder he had felt that morning by the creek. The search for the beings continued with new technology. Environmental DNA sampling could sometimes detect their presence from water sources, though the creatures seemed to avoid areas frequently tested. Satellite imaging occasionally picked up heat signatures consistent with massive bipedal figures in remote regions, but direct encounters remained extremely rare, as if the beings had learned from that first widely publicized sighting to be even more cautious around humans. Jake also funded research into what he called parallel intelligence, the study of non-human intelligences that had developed independently of human civilization. Sasquatch represented one example, but their discovery opened the door to reconsidering the cognitive potential of other species. Researchers uncovered evidence of advanced problem-solving abilities, the transmission of cultural knowledge, and even the possibility of abstract thought had been documented in multiple species. The rigid hierarchy that once placed humans at the pinnacle of intelligence was giving way to a deeper understanding of consciousness and awareness throughout the natural world. Jake also became involved in efforts to protect indigenous knowledge systems globally. Recognizing that many cultures hold information about species not yet discovered or formally recognized, the Jackson Foundation funded programs to record traditional ecological knowledge before it was lost. By working with elders and knowledge keepers, they preserved information that could lead to future discoveries. A few new species were indeed identified through this process, though none as dramatic as Sasquatch. The legal status of the beings remained complex. They existed in a gray area between animals and humans, with protections stronger than those for endangered species, yet not extending to the full rights of humanity. Jake advocated for a new category of protection for highly intelligent non-human species, a framework that could apply not only to Sasquatch, but also to great apes, cetaceans, and potentially others. As human understanding of animal intelligence grew, private attempts to capture or study the beings continued despite legal prohibitions. Jake worked with law enforcement to monitor and prosecute those who violated protective laws. Several high-profile cases resulted in significant prison sentences, sending a clear message that these creatures were not curiosities or trophies. The black market for Sasquatch artifacts was ruthlessly suppressed, though counterfeit items circulated widely among gullible collectors. Educational curricula were updated to include the Sasquatch discovery as a case study in scientific method, conservation biology, and the importance of indigenous knowledge. Children grew up learning about the beings as part of North America's wilderness, alongside bears, wolves, and eagles. The sense of mystery and wonder endured, but it was tempered by scientific understanding and respect for the creature's desire for privacy. By his 60s, Jake's health had begun to decline. Years of harsh fieldwork had taken their toll. He suffered from arthritis, the result of countless nights sleeping on cold ground, and chronic coughs from exposure to extreme weather. Yet he continued to venture into the wilderness whenever he could, drawn back by the same love of nature that had led him to that stream years before. Jake never expected to see it again. Yet he found peace in knowing the creatures were still out there, living their lives far from human interference. He began writing a comprehensive book about the discovery and its consequences. It was not merely a memoir, but a scientific and philosophical exploration of what it means to share the world with another intelligent species. He interviewed dozens of researchers, indigenous knowledge keepers, and conservationists, weaving together a narrative that reached far beyond his personal experience to consider the broader implications of the discovery. The book would become his legacy, a detailed record of humanity's first confirmed contact with another intelligent primate. The Sasquatch population appeared stable, though exact numbers remained unknown. Genetic analysis of hair samples suggested reasonable diversity, indicating the species was not in immediate danger from inbreeding. Climate change, however, posed challenges as habitats shifted and traditional food sources became less reliable. Conservation efforts increasingly focused on maintaining wilderness corridors that allowed the beings to adapt to changing conditions. Jake established an endowment to fund ongoing Sasquatch research, ensuring that even after his passing, scientists would have resources to continue studying and protecting the creatures. He worked with lawyers to safeguard his original footage, preventing its commercial exploitation while keeping it available for scientific and educational purposes. The film had become one of the most important documents in modern natural history, and Jake felt a deep responsibility to preserve it for future generations. From time to time, new sightings were reported and verified, each adding to the understanding of Sasquatch behavior and range. A pattern emerged, suggesting seasonal movements, perhaps following food sources or avoiding human activity. Some researchers hypothesized that the beings possessed complex mental maps of human movement patterns, allowing them to navigate around our presence. Such intelligence and adaptability suggested they could endure even as humans increasingly encroached on the wilderness. Jake often reflected on the ethical implications of his discovery. Had he done the right thing in revealing the creature's existence? Would they have been better off left in the realm of myth and legend? There was no way to know for certain, yet the legal protections and habitat conservation that had followed his footage had undeniably benefited not only Sasquatch, but countless other species. Still, he sometimes felt the weight of exposing such remarkable beings to human scrutiny. The scientific community continued to debate their origins and relationship to humans. Some evidence suggested they might be descendants of Gigantopithecus, the giant ape believed to have gone extinct hundreds of thousands of years ago. Others proposed they were a relict population of Paranthropus, a robust hominin that once coexisted with early humans. DNA analysis offered tantalizing clues but no definitive answers. The beings remained an evolutionary enigma, a reminder of how much we still don't know about our planet's history. Jake's influence extended far beyond Sasquatch research. His foundation funded the protection of critical habitats worldwide, supported indigenous land rights, and promoted sustainable development that balanced human needs with wildlife conservation. He had become a voice for the voiceless. He stood as an advocate for species unable to defend themselves. His TED Talks on coexistence with wildlife were viewed millions of times, inspiring a generation of conservationists. As the final years of his life approached, Jake devoted more time to mentoring young researchers and less to fieldwork. What he offered was not only knowledge, but wisdom earned from decades of patient observation and respect for the natural world. He often emphasized that the greatest discoveries rarely came from active pursuit, but from presence and awareness, the willingness to recognize the extraordinary when it appeared. His students went on to make their own discoveries, each one adding to humanity's understanding of the intricate web of life on Earth. In many ways, Sasquatch became ambassadors for wilderness conservation. Their compelling presence, whether seen or unseen, justified the protection of vast ecosystems. Old-growth forests that might have been logged remained standing because they could harbor these beings. River basins were preserved, wildlife corridors established, and development curtailed in critical areas. The economic value of protecting these systems far outweighed any short-term gains from exploitation. Jake never forgot that October morning, the mix of fear and awe as he watched the impossible take shape through his viewfinder. It was the moment that defined his life, the pivot around which everything else revolved. He had been an ordinary man in an extraordinary situation, yet he had the presence of mind to capture it faithfully. That blend of preparation and opportunity changed not only his life, but perhaps the course of scientific history. In his study, surrounded by maps, photographs, and scientific papers, Jake often returned to the original footage. He knew each frame by heart, every movement of those remarkable beings etched permanently into his memory. Sometimes he noticed new details, subtle behaviors he had overlooked in countless earlier viewings. Each observation added to the growing body of knowledge about creatures that had shared our continent for millennia, unseen. The world had shifted profoundly since that morning by the creek. What was once thought impossible had become accepted truth. Children now grew up knowing that intelligent, elusive beings lived deep in the forests, just out of sight. The wonder of this knowledge inspired countless young people to pursue careers in science and conservation. Jake had not merely discovered a new species, he had rekindled humanity's sense of curiosity and exploration. Letters poured in from people whose lives had been changed by his discovery. Scientists who had found their calling, conservationists inspired to defend the wild, indigenous communities who felt their traditional knowledge affirmed. Yet the letters that touched him most came from children, thanking him for proving that magic still existed in the world, that wonders could be found if one looked closely enough. Jake knew his time was limited. Doctors were frank about the toll that decades of hard living in pursuit of passion had taken on his body, but he faced the end without regret. That morning by the stream had given him a gift, a glimpse into a hidden world. He had chosen to use that gift for the benefit of both the beings and the ecosystems they inhabited. His legacy would live on in the protected wilderness, in ongoing research, and in the sense of wonder he helped restore to a world grown too cynical. On his final journey into the wild, Jake returned to the general area where he had first seen them, though not the exact spot. He sat by another stream, watching the water slide over ancient stones, listening to the forest sounds he had loved for decades. He did not expect to see the beings again, and he did not need to. Knowing they were out there, living their lives deep in the wilderness, was enough. He had done his part to secure their survival, now others would carry the work forward. As the sun sank behind towering trees and shadows stretched across the forest floor, Jake felt a profound sense of completion. He had been the bridge between two worlds, the human and the hidden, the known and the unknown. His footage had opened a door that could never again be closed, forever altering our understanding of the natural world and our place within it. The beings by the creek had been his teachers, showing him that mystery and wonder still endure in an age that believes it has charted everything. The impact of Jake Jackson's discovery would echo for generations. Textbooks would feature his footage, scientists would build upon his work, and conservationists would point to his example in protecting wild places. Yet his greatest legacy was the restoration of wonder, the proof that mysteries remain, that creatures still await discovery, that there are reasons to venture into the wild with open eyes and a ready camera. Sasquatch remained elusive, appearing only rarely to remind us of their presence before fading once more into the forest's shadows. They became symbols of wilderness itself, representing the untamed spaces that endure despite humanity's relentless efforts to map and categorize every corner of the planet. Even with their existence confirmed, they stayed mysterious, a humbling reminder that nature always keeps secrets, always maintains realms beyond human comprehension or control. The Jackson Foundation continued the work. Long after his passing, funding continued to support research and conservation efforts that protected not only Sasquatch, but the entire ecosystems they inhabited. Young scientists applied new technologies that he could never have imagined to study the beings. Each generation built upon the work of the one before, yet all adhered to the principles he had set forth. Respect the creatures' autonomy, minimize interference in their lives, and protect their habitats above all else. The world had become more mysterious because of one man's mourning by a stream, a perfect moment when the hidden world revealed itself to someone prepared to bear witness. Jake Jackson had been that person, the right man in the right place at the right time, with the right tools and the right mindset. His legacy was not only the discovery of a new species, but also the enduring reminder that discovery is still possible, that wonder still exists, and that the natural world continues to hold surprises for those patient and prepared enough to see them.